how Russia controls the United States and most Americans. I'm going to reveal this shocking intel to you in 3 simple, fast steps. Step number 1, let's go over the food supply and food prices. Now, before we go any further, I want to point out that some of the conclusions in this video are going to trigger a lot of you watching. And I don't like the fact that Russia has leverage over the United States and Americans any more than you do. But we have to acknowledge reality in these difficult times. I want to remind you of a quote from a great Chinese philosopher. There is no greater danger than underestimating your opponent. So the last thing I think we should be doing is underestimating Russia. Now let's go to the whiteboard so we can better understand how Russia has significant leverage over the global food supply and global food prices. It all starts with fertilizer. We need that going into the soil to produce the crops. Let's say we have wheat and corn. Those grains go to the store, or the grains go to this other farmer who uses them to feed the cows, chickens, pork, let's just say protein. So the grains go to the store, the grains go to feed the protein that also goes to the store, and that's where the average Joe and Jane gets their food, or they go to the restaurant sources their food from the store as well. So just kind of reverse engineering this, we can see that if we don't have fertilizer, basically we don't have food, any type of food at any price. So then the question becomes, okay, well, where do we get this fertilizer? What goes into it? Because obviously it's extremely important. There's 3 main components. We've got potassium, nitrogen, and phosphorus. Now what's interesting is you have to have all 3. You can't just have 2 out of the 3 and then the crops kind of grow. It doesn't work that way. Also, with nitrogen, you have to constantly put it into the soil. Now, some of the other fertilizers, they stay within the soil, like I believe phosphorus does to a certain degree. But with nitrogen, you have to reapply it to the soil, I believe at least twice per year. So now let's go back even further and say, okay, well, where do they get nitrogen? Well, a lot of that comes from natural gas. And where do they get potassium? Well, they inject the potassium into the fertilizer with kind of a derivative called potash. So this potash is incredibly important. So is the natural gas. Without the potash or the natural gas, basically you don't have fertilizer to go into the soil. You don't have fertilizer to go into the soil, you don't have food. That's pretty much the bottom line. Which takes us straight back to Russia. So between Russia and Belarus, they produce 40% of global potash. Editor, let's go ahead and throw up the chart. And while you're looking at this chart, you'll also notice that China also produces a significant amount of potash. So if you took the potash supply of China, Russia, and Belarus, which are all friendly to one another and could push back against the United States and the West, if you took that offline, you would have a global food shortage. I mean, the food supply would quite literally collapse. In some places, you couldn't get food at any price. And that's just one component. Let's now look at the natural gas. Editor, go ahead and throw up a chart. We can see that Russia supplies the world with 638.5 billion cubic meters of natural gas every single year, second only to the United States. And a lot of the natural gas supplied by Russia goes directly to produce nitrogen, which goes into the fertilizer. So the main takeaway is Russia, who controls Belarus and could partner with China to push back on the United States and the West. If Russia decides to take their components that go into fertilizer offline, this would create a global food crisis to the likes we have never seen. And don't kid yourself, it would not only affect areas like the Middle East and Africa, it would be devastating to the United States and Americans. Just think about what would happen in your local area if you couldn't get food at any price. Step number 2, if you control energy, then you will also control the economy. So let's start by going over a chart of gas consumption right here in the United States. This chart goes back to 1990 all the way to 2020. And on the left, we see the gas consumption expressed in billions of gallons. So over the course of the year, as an example, we start off in 1990, the United States was consuming about 115 billion gallons of gasoline per year. Now this goes up to 2000, then comes back down, probably the dot-com bust, the recession, and then goes back up, peaks out at about 2004, around 140 billion gallons consumed annually. Then we have the Great Recession, the GFC, goes back down, then comes back up and peaks out just before 2020 at 145 billion gallons per year. But I want you to notice that even when we went into the lockdown, where we literally locked people in their house, they could not drive, they couldn't do anything, the overall gas consumption didn't go to zero. In fact, it only went from 145 billion gallons per year down to 127 billion gallons, meaning for gas consumption in the United States, there is a high degree of demand inelasticity. So understanding this, we realize that no matter how high the price goes, to a certain extent, we are going to continue to pay the price. We'll have to rob Peter to pay Paul. So if the average American has $100, one of the last things they're going to stop spending money on is gas consumption. Therefore, they're going to not spend money on other things because their income is just as inelastic as the demand for gas. Now let's move on to the second chart. It goes back about 6 months to today's date. On the left, we go from $2 up to $3.50. This is the price of gas, about the average price of gas in the United States. And I'd like to point out that going back to December, it was under $2 a gallon. And then we go to just before the invasion, when Russia invaded Ukraine, is about $2.75. And it spiked up to $3.75. It's come back down, but it's now up around $3.50 again. So this spike that we saw was $1. So let's think this through. If the United States is consuming 150 billion gallons of gas, approximately, every single year, if the price of gas goes up by $1, that's $150 billion of consumption that's going to have to be taken out of other areas in the economy. But there's a lot of people that are predicting that if Russia cuts off their supply of oil to the United States, to the West, and especially if they do this in tandem with Saudi Arabia. Editor, go ahead and throw up the chart. We can see that between Russia and Saudi Arabia, they are the majority of the world's supply of oil. So if Russia and Saudi Arabia team up to restrict the supply of oil, like we talked about China, Russia, Belarus teaming up to restrict the supply of potash or fertilizer to grow food, we would see the exact same dynamic we were talking about in step number 1, where energy prices, gas prices could skyrocket, which is why a lot of these experts that specialize in commodity prices say that we could see $6 a gallon gas in the United States. Well, let's think this through. If we started at $2, go up to $6, that's an increase of $4 per gallon. If we're consuming 150 billion gallons per year, this means that there's going to be $600 billion of consumer spending that's going to have to be taken from other areas in the economy. We know that one man's spending is another man's income. Therefore, if we take $600 billion of spending out of the economy, we're also going to take $600 billion of income. But it doesn't stop there. Because if we take $600 billion of income out of the economy, it further reduces the spending, which means less and less income. This creates a feedback loop where the reduction in spending creates a reduction in income, which creates a further reduction in spending and income, taking GDP or the economy down with it. So when we look at step number 1 and step number 2 through the lens of how things actually are instead of how we wish they were, we come to the conclusion that Russia has a tremendous amount of leverage on the price of our energy and the price of our food. And at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what the value of your house is, what the value of your stock portfolio, how much money, gold, or Bitcoin you have. If you don't have energy, if you don't have food, you got nothing. Oh, but wait, there is more. Our good friends like Klaus Schwab at the World Economic Forum realize that higher energy prices and higher food prices could be a big problem. So they have got a solution for all of us. Editor, let's cut to the internet. This is an article from Zero Hedge, title World Economic Forum issues ominous warning over coming food crisis. And they're talking about inflation more broadly. They recommend a more sustainable diet, among other things. So let's dive into Klaus's solution for all of our problems. And it starts off by highlighting this Bloomberg opinion piece from a gal that's one of these World Economic Forum types. Her name is Teresa Ghilarducci. And what she points out is if you're struggling with higher and higher prices, well, you can take the bus, don't buy in bulk, try lentils instead of meat. And just remember that nobody said this is going to be fun. And you go down further into the article, and they highlight other suggestions made by the World Economic Forum. And basically, they're the same type of thing. Go ahead and change your diet, become a vegetarian, or just go ahead and eat bugs, as they have famously said. And I'm not making that up. You can go ahead and see this article from the World Economic Forum, why we need to give insects the role they deserve in our food system. We'll just go back to step number 1. Remember how we were talking about the need for fertilizer? Well, you don't need fertilizer to grow bugs. So problem solved right there. So basically, you can change your diet, you can ride a bicycle, you can use more public transportation, and you can live in a city to where you can walk everywhere. And if this sounds familiar, it should, because basically what they're talking about is the Great Reset agenda. I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole, but I want to highlight how the global elite, the World Economic Forum and the IMF, the Davos types, will never let a crisis go to waste, especially not a crisis in food and energy. Step number 3. Well, what about green energy? Isn't that a solution? Because if we weren't so reliant on fossil fuels, we wouldn't be so reliant on Russia. Well, the green energy of the future is most likely going to be nuclear. Whether you like it or not, that's just the reality of the situation. And if the future is nuclear energy, then the future is also uranium. So let's think this one through. This is the uranium cycle, basically how we go from uranium to electricity using nuclear energy. So it starts off with the uranium being mined, then it's milled, and then it's turned into a gas. The gas needs to be enriched. And once the uranium is enriched, it turns into this fuel pellet that goes into the fuel rod, and that's how they create the electricity. All right, well, how does Russia play into this story? First of all, Kazakhstan, which Russia basically controls, produces 40% of the global supply of uranium. And it doesn't end there. Russia themselves account for about 35% of the in total enrichment of uranium. And they have the most capacity, followed by China, a country that we've highlighted throughout this video. They're becoming closer and closer with. And I also want to point out that nuclear energy isn't just the green energy source of the future, but it's also one of the main energy sources of today, right now in 2022. In fact, right now, 10% of global electricity comes from nuclear. So what's the point? The point is, if Russia controls 40% of the supply, and they control 35% plus of the enrichment process, Russia not only controls the future of today, but they'll most likely control the future of tomorrow. So I think this entire video can be summed up by a quote from someone who had a tremendous amount of influence on Klaus Schwab. This was Henry Kissinger, and he said that if you control the food, you control the people. If you control the energy, you control continents. It makes you wonder who's really pulling the strings. Is it the politicians or is it the global elite? For more content that'll help you build wealth and thrive in a world of out-of-control central banks and big governments, check out this playlist right here, and I will see you on the next video.